for over 7 years. I specialize auditing government agencies, especially K through 12s. Over my 7 years of experience, I've probably audited over, I'd say, a couple hundred ASB accounts. So I'm going to lean on that experience for the training today and give you feedback as far as our perspective as auditors. And certainly if you have any questions that maybe stuff we've looked at in the past, you have questions about why do we looked at those things or what we're looking at, please don't hesitate to ask those questions, because we're here definitely to be a resource to you. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Arthur.
My name's Arthur. I've been with the firm for 10.5 years now. I've served as the senior manager on this engagement for 3 years as well. I specialize in the same industries that Joe specializes in, so a lot of K-12 audits, community college district audits, and then not-for-profits and other government agencies. With that, we'll start going into the PowerPoint presentation. So in front of you, you should have PowerPoint slides and then the ASB manual. The ASB manual is more for your reference. We won't go into it in detail, but it's just there for you just in case you need something to reference to when you're looking over the procedures for cash receipts, cash disbursements, and so on. Okay. So the first couple of slides that you see up here, it's not included in your packet, but we'll provide the district with a link to this website. It's published. It's a 2016 study that was done by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. It's them going out to the public and then getting information on fraud. So the very first slide that you see here shows the 3 primary categories of occupational fraud. And I don't know if it's clear on that screen, but the area with the most fraud is asset misappropriation with 83%. The next area is corruption, and then financial statement fraud. The next slide, it displays the initial detection of occupational fraud, so the methods of how fraud is detected. At the very top is tips. It accounts for about 42%, about 42% in 2014 and about 30% in 2016. So this is through your whistleblower policy, the hotline, emails. I believe the district has provided a list of resources that you could use for the whistleblower, or links and phone number to the whistleblower hotline. The next method is the internal audit. So it accounts for about 14%, and then followed by management's review. At the very bottom is the external audit, where we are not engaged to find fraud, but we do detect fraud. If we are to detect fraud through audit procedures, we would bring it to management's attention. So it's about 3% with external audits. The very next slide shows how internal control weaknesses have an impact on fraud. So when in their study, when they saw that there were a lack of internal controls, it contributed to the misappropriation of assets. They saw 30% increase in fraud related to lack of internal controls. When there's lack of management review, it contributed to about 20% of fraud. And then tone at the top, the area where this is most impacted is financial statement fraud, because usually the people who override controls are usually people in management positions. So that's usually where you see a corruption for fraud. Okay. So because we're talking about internal controls and the likelihood or the impact it would have on fraud, that's why we want to cover ASB, because this is usually an area where, for school districts, we see a lot of fraud occurring, because there's a lot of different people involved in the process for ASB. There's a lot of cash exchange. Cash is liquid, so there's a lot of opportunity for fraud to occur for ASB funds, and that's why we want to cover ASB controls and go over that in detail. Okay. So the first 2 slides talks about the roles and responsibilities for ASB funds. At the very top of the hierarchy is the state of California. They are responsible for establishing the laws and regulations that govern activities of school districts, including ASB accounts. So there's ed codes out there that talks about the rules and regulations for ASB funds. In the FICMAT report and the ASB manual that you have in front of you, there should be some ed code references there that talks about the laws and regulations related to that. The next organization is the California Department of Education. They develop policies regarding any legislation or regulations enacted as a result of the law. And then the Board of Education is responsible for everything that happens at the district. So they're responsible for overseeing all the ASB activities. There's the Ed code out there, Ed code 48930. The governing board has the authority to approve the formation of student body organization within the district. Very next slide, at the very top is the superintendent. They're responsible for ensuring that board policies are implemented and that staff follow those policies. The next one is the business services at the district office. They're responsible for the general oversight of the student body activities. They provide a resource for questions and answers. So if you have any questions related to ASBs, how it should be accounted for, make sure you contact the district office and seek feedback from them. The principal is responsible for the student body organization, the financing activities for ASBs. They have the most important responsibility at the school sites. The ASB advisor must be a certificated employee. They ensure policies and procedures are followed, so this should be a person that understands the laws and regulations related to ASBs. They should also be aware of what the district policies and procedures are for ASB accounting. The ASB bookkeeper, pretty straightforward. They're responsible for ASB bookkeeping. And then the student council, they authorize activities, approve expenditures, and follow policies and procedures.
So what's the purpose of ASB? ASB is at school districts really for the benefit of the kids involved in the clubs and the school as a whole. ASB is there to promote general welfare, moral, and an educational experience. ASB also helps students learn how to operate a small business. I can remember I was part of a student club in middle school. I think we sold ice cream, and that experience, it really had a profound effect on me. I enjoyed, the handling of money and learning about how money works, and in a lot of ways, I think that's why I'm an accountant today. Kind of gave me that early experience of how things work. So it's a great experience for the students to take part in. Additionally, it helps them involve leadership skills. That'll help them eventually in their careers. So some general principles of ASB. So for ASB, funds are derived from the student body and must be expended in a manner approved by the student governing body. So the students really have the final say as far as how the funds are spent, especially in an organized ASB, which I'll cover in a little bit. Student body funds must be expended for the benefit of those students currently enrolled in the school who have contributed to the accumulation of funds. So those students who are raising the funds, typically those funds that they raise should be used for their benefit. Prior approval by the student governing body must be attained in raising revenue and expenditures of student funds. So anytime there is a fundraiser, the principal at that site will have final say and approval of that fundraiser or revenue generating expenditure. When we audit your sites, this is one thing we always look at. We'll ask you if there's any fundraising events, and if there was there a principal involvement and also principal approval. And we like to see that approval evidenced by a signature from the principal. The next few slides will cover unorganized and organized ASB. This is a term we commonly use as auditors. It's maybe a term you haven't used before, but when we visit you at your site, one of the first questions we'll ask you is, are you an organized or unorganized ASB? And depending on that answer, that really dictates the procedures we perform. Typically, if you're an unorganized ASB, the procedures we're required to perform would be less. If you're an organized ASB, usually there's a lot more activity going on, so we would audit more items. So what is an unorganized ASB? Students do not govern the ASB organization, so typically an ASB advisor or principal or some type of administrator would oversee the unorganized ASB. Usually there is only primary student body organization and no additional clubs, so you don't have multiple clubs in an unorganized ASB. Unorganized ASBs are usually adult education, continuation sites, special education, ROPs, and K through 8 schools are usually considered unorganized ASBs. So if you're an administrator at an elementary school, for the most part, a lot of the elementary schools we see are unorganized ASBs. Students usually have limited involvement in making decisions about fundraising events and how funds are to be spent. So you will not see student minutes for unorganized ASB. Usually the advisors are having the final approval on how items are spent in the fundraising events. The governing body delegates the authority to oversee in the raising of spending of funds to the principal/school site administrator. So again, the administrators are really overseeing these unorganized ASBs. And although authority is delegated to the principal and school site administrator, the rules and guidelines regarding fundraising and allowable expenditures remain the same. So just because you're unorganized, that doesn't necessarily mean there's different rules as far as how the funds can be spent and the fundraising approvals. So organized ASB. What's an organized ASB? Usually an organized ASB is either in middle school or high school. These type of sites typically will have multiple student clubs, and they'll have student councils that get involved in these clubs, and a lot of times there'll be student minutes that document the activities of these clubs. Students in organized ASBs are primarily responsible for their organization, so instead of having an administrator oversee things as you would see in an unorganized ASB, usually the students are really really involved in these programs, overseeing the activities. The student council and student leaders hold formal meetings, develop budgets, plan fundraisers, and decide how funds will be spent and approve payments. So they're really the ones initiating a lot of the transactions. The students make the decisions and have primary authority over the funds. The school administrators, ASB bookkeepers, or club advisors will assist. So they're there for an oversight role overseeing these ASBs. Additionally, for unorganized ASBs, as I mentioned, they are required to have minutes of meetings or meetings of minutes. Because there's not a formal process of students' governance for organized bodies, the student council in each club must maintain a record of each meeting. So a lot of times when we are at your school site auditing your accounts, we'll ask for these meeting minutes. If there's a purchase, we want to make sure that the student council first approved that purchase. So we'll say, could you show us the minutes behind that particular purchase where the students documented that they wanted to expend their funds on that item. The meeting minutes for each club should document the following. There's a few examples of what we like to see. Date, time, and place of the meeting, those who are in attendance, what was discussed, what action was taken during the meeting. As auditors, the more detail, the better for us. So definitely if all these bullet points can be met in meeting minutes, that's there for our benefit. So any questions so far on unorganized or organized ASB? Again, when we visit your sites, that's probably one of the first questions we're going to ask. Are you organized or unorganized? And based on your response, that's really going to dictate the amount of procedures we perform.
So how many of you have seen this figure before, the fraud triangle? So it's a powerful image. So when these three risks are present, this is when the risk of fraud occurring is the highest. So there's three different items on this triangle: the rationalization, pressure, and opportunity. So for rationalization is the ability to persuade yourself that something that you otherwise know is wrong is okay. So an example of this is, like you tell yourself, just this one time, I'm just borrowing funds, I'll return it. No one's going to get hurt. I deserve it because I'm working these extra hours, they're not paying me enough. So those are some of the examples of rationalization for why someone will commit fraud. The opportunity is the ability to commit fraud. So this deals with all of your internal controls, our processes and controls in place for the district to detect or prevent fraud from occurring. When there's no controls in place, as I mentioned before, this is when the ability to commit fraud is higher, so opportunity. Pressure, it could be financial pressure at home. Let's say you fall behind on some loans, a spouse is laid off, health bills start accumulating. So some financial pressures or personal pressures creating the motivation to commit fraud. So when these three pressures these three items are all there, that's when the fraud risk is the greatest. And the area that you have the area that you have the ability to control the most is the opportunity. building a system of internal controls to prevent or detect fraud. And this is why it's very important for us to go over the controls that you need to have in place or related to ASB. As I said before, just because there's a lot of people exchanging cash, there's a lot of people involved in this process. That's why it's important to build a strong internal control system related to ASB.
Yeah, as we mentioned, I mean, these funds are the students, and we certainly want to make sure there's proper controls in place to limit that opportunity. So this training is there for your benefit, just to provide you examples of how to have strong controls so that fraud does not occur.
So the very next slide, we talk about cash receipt process, the internal controls that we would expect for a site to have related to cash receipts. The very first question when we're out there that we will ask ourselves is, how do we ensure that all the money that was deposited was all the money that should have been deposited? So we look for a clear audit trail of when the money was initially receipted through the whole process. Like, we look at every time we exchange hands where there are dual accounts of cash, is it evidence? So that when we look at internal controls, we have to be able to see that review or that review or that preparation occurring. So we look at some form of signature or initial saying that individual reviewed the cash count form, or they counted in dual custody the cash that was received. So some examples that we look for are pre-numbered cash receipts, cash receipt records. We look for reconciliations, making sure that's reviewed. So when you exchange cash, when you deposit funds, making sure that someone's counting that cash and evidencing that they did review the cash count. When the teachers turn in cash into the ASB office, there should be dual counts of cash. So the teacher should count the cash that was turned in front of the ASB clerk or ASB secretary, and the ASB secretary should confirm that count by initially signing that, yes, I do agree with the cash count the cash that was provided. This reduces the amount of discrepancies between what the teachers turn in and what the ASB clerk is counting. Some of the issues that we see at some of our districts is that the teachers will drop off the money, the ASB clerk won't count to the next day or maybe next week, and that there's a discrepancy. Who's right? Is the teacher right, or is the ASB clerk right? It creates more opportunity to commit fraud too, because if the ASB clerk decides that maybe I'll take $100 and say that you didn't turn in $100, how do you prove that the teacher was right? So that's why it's very important to have that dual count of cash every time cash is exchanged. The very next slide, continuing for cash receipts, for fundraisers, the governing board is responsible for approving fundraising events. This ensures that there's no conflicts of ideals with the district policies and procedures. The revenue potential form, ensuring that budget to actual is used. The budget to actual shows what the student body expects to generate in income and expenses versus what actually occurred. So some things to look for when you're looking at the budget to actuals are there any significant variances between budget to actuals? Was the activity profitable, because you don't want to continue on to an activity that's creating more losses than income for ASB funds. Something that's prohibited are games of chance, so like that you can't do a lottery or you can't do anything with gambling, so that's prohibited.
And fundraisers, unfortunately, is an area we see a lot of findings in. It sounds pretty straightforward, but a lot of times we'll get the form was never signed by the principal. So if you're going to have a fundraiser, just make sure that you have a principal sign off on the district's approved form, because that's definitely something we're going to look for when we audit you. And if there wasn't approval, say sometimes the principal may informally say, yeah, I approve that activity, but you really need to have evidence of that approval and a signature and a date. So that's something we will look at when we audit your site.
Very next slide talks about deposits. Cash receipts should be deposited timely. So we usually ask for maybe a weekly deposit if possible, depending on volume too. So maybe like if there's very limited sales or cash receipt through the week, just taking a look at that and determining what makes most sense. The reason why we look for timely deposit is that we want to make sure that it gets into the bank account versus sitting at a school site in someone's desk or in a lock safe or whatever, where someone might be able to take funds over the weekend or something like that. So that's why we make sure that deposits are occurring timely. So cash receipts should never be taken home over the weekends or holidays. So I know sometimes sites will have fundraising events like for a game or whatever in the evening. So never taking those funds home, because if you do lose the funds, then it becomes an issue. So whenever that occurs, when you have like an event after school hours, making sure that gets brought back to the school site and then locked in a safe overnight. Never take cash home, so don't lock it in your car either. So we've had instances where cash was stolen from someone's car, so it becomes an issue as well. So making sure that you don't lock it or leave it in your car or overnight.
So any questions on cash receipts? All right. The next area is cash disbursements. So as far as from an auditor perspective, when we visit your school sites, we will follow the entire process of a cash disbursement. So we'll start off with the initiation of a purchase. So if you're at a organized ASB, that initiation again starts with the meeting minutes. So the students document in their meeting minutes, so they want to purchase something for their club. So we'll start with those meeting minutes. We'll then look to make sure the appropriate forms were approved for, say, a purchase order or a requisition form. Then we'll follow up and make sure that an invoice was actually received that matches that purchase. And then finally, we'll look at any checks that were written and make sure that there's the proper approvals for the check. And finally, we'll actually trace that check to the bank statement to make sure it cleared. So when we audit cash disbursements, we follow everything from the initial approval of the item all the way until the payment of the item. As mentioned, purchase requisition orders must be submitted for prior approval by the student body organization, so they initiate this process. A student body organization is not obligated to pay for an expenditure or order by a teacher, student, or person who has not first received a written purchase order. So that's the control in place that helps to prevent fraud, that there is an oversight and approval in place. Payment must be made only after evidence of receipt of goods. So until the items are received in full and match the original purchase order, there shouldn't be a payment occurring. Expenditures must be supported by invoices, again, further supporting that purchase. If there are equipment purchases, student body is responsible for the repair, maintenance, and upkeep and insurance of that equipment purchase. Equipment purchases can sometimes be a little bit of a gray area as far as what the organization or student body can approve. I've known in the past other districts we've seen, for example, that the football coach wants a new lawnmower for his football field, so he will try to use the student body organization to purchase that on his behalf. So if there is a purchase like that or something you think does not benefit truly the students, and it's, like I said, it's a gray area, so certainly work with the district, and the district will work with us as far as determining whether that equipment purchase is appropriate, because a lot of times it's hard to determine whether equipment is actually for the students or maybe for the district's benefit. So reach out to us and reach out to the district and utilize us as a resource as far as determining if equipment purchase is proper. In regards to insurance, insurance is the responsibility of the district office as part of the district's overall insurance coverage. So management of ASB funds, some other items to know as far as when you're overseeing these funds. For balances that exist at year end, you want to ensure that you review these balances during the year to ensure that funds are being spent for the benefit of students who are enrolled when the funds were raised, unless pre-approved. So typically at the beginning of the year, you'll see a high cash balance in a student body account, but that will usually dwindle down as there are trips for the student clubs throughout the year. Now, if a club has a balance at the end of the year, students should determine how they should spend the money, gift it to another club, or donate it to the general ASB. So the point with this is that the ASB funds are the students' funds, so the students really have a lot of say in how those funds are used after they leave the school.
Okay. So next slide, so you're responsible for reviewing bank reconciliations, cash receipt documents. So what do you look for? So when you're looking at bank reconciliation financial statements, you want to make sure that the deposits are clearing in a timely manner. So it's not outstanding for more than 3 to 5 business days, because usually it doesn't take long for a bank to process a deposit. look for any unusual transactions. So making sure when you receive the bank statements that you have all the pages within the bank statement, that there's no missing pages. And looking at the check images and the deposits to make sure that there's no unusual transactions, everything that you would expect to see as far as disbursements and cash receipts. It's very important to pay close attention to check images. Look at who the vendor or who the payee is, making sure that the proper levels of signature approvals are there as well. Cash disbursements, detail of invoice are all the items that were approved are on the invoice. So did someone go in detail look at the invoice to make sure that everything that was ordered was properly approved? And then invoices, making sure that they're not paid twice. One of the internal controls that we see some of our clients using is like a stamp and a signature saying that it's been paid to prevent invoices from being paid twice. And then student stores, when you perform the periodic inventory count, look at inventory shortages. How often is this occurring? Are there any unusual variances with the inventory? Are there cash shortages for deposits? When you look at the control process, is cash count done in dual custody when turning funds in? Cash reconciliations, making sure that's performed at least on a monthly basis for reconciliations. And the deposit form, making sure that matches back to the bank statement and the amount that was deposited. So looking at the deposit slip, does that match to the bank statement? So making sure all that information agrees.
The best practices. As we mentioned, Art mentioned earlier, if there aren't controls in place, there's a lot of opportunity for fraud to exist. So the best practices are some items that we'll note that really help to prevent frauds from occurring and help there to be strong internal controls. The first point is never leave money unattended. So anytime money is being collected, make sure that if it's being collected at the school site, that it's being deposited in a safe box. And as Art mentioned, we like to see those items being deposited in a timely manner to the bank so that you don't have to worry about those funds maybe being stolen or something like that. Always count all money with a witness. This is probably an area where you see the most findings is that when money is initially received, there's not evidence of a count occurring. When money is counted, there always should be two people that are counting the money to ensure not only that the amount's correct, but to ensure that there's agreement on the amounts. So when the money is collected and counted, make sure that there's signatures showing evidence of the count, because that's one thing we always look at. When possible, have two people transport deposits as another best practice. Always sign an initial and have a witness sign initial documentation in as many places as possible, indicating the status and the amount of money that that there were two signatures. So again, reiterating the point that I mentioned, that this is a very common finding that two people sometimes do count the funds, but there's not necessarily evidence of the count occurring sometimes by per signature. Always retain duplicate cash count forms for club's records. This is something that we'll look at when we audit you, is the cash count forms. And always protect the ASB bookkeeper by counting cash with them and obtaining signatures attesting the cash counts agree. Some additional best practices. Safeguard user identities. Use passwords, combinations, and other access controls. Double check bank reconciliations, canceled and clear checks, and check endorsements. Obtain proper authorizations for all transactions, including journal entries, transfers, reimbursements, and advances. And I know a lot of times the forms that the districts produce show these various areas that signatures should occur. So to always make sure when you're completing a form that there's always appropriate signatures on the form. Obtain proper authorization for all transactions, including journal entries. I just mentioned that one. Always compare the advisor's copies of club transactions with the financial report, so just double checking everything. Ensure that all club advisors retain club-related records for as long as they serve as a club advisor. And ensure that the ASB bookkeeper is never afraid to say no. And finally, the ASB bookkeeper should never be afraid to refuse an incorrect deposit or improper authorization for disbursement.
The next slide lists some of the common ASB findings that we typically see at our school district audits. At the very top, it's the fundraising approval form. As Joe mentioned before, making sure that that's properly evidenced with a signature or initial. So we can't use verbal confirmation as part of the audit process, because without being able to see a signature or initial, we can't determine whether or not that control is properly operating. For cash receipts, making sure that cash receipts are issued when funds are turned into the ASB office. So this depends on the dollar amount as well. Like if it's just for pencils for like 50 cents or 15 cents each, doesn't make sense to issue a receipt every time. But if they're for larger items, then that's when you would want to issue receipts to the individuals that are turning in the funds. Tally sheets, making sure that that's used to support the number of items sold in the unit per item. So a lot of times we see districts not using this when they turn in funds. They'll just give the cash but not really show the number of items that was sold to reconcile back to what was deposited. So we want to see if you're selling T-shirts for $15 and $15 per shirt and you sold 5, we want to be able to reconcile that back to what was actually deposited. Cash counts not being performed in dual custody. A lot of the times this isn't evidence, so a lot of the responses that we'll hear is that, oh, the teacher was there, we counted in dual custody, but they didn't have time to sign it, so I signed it, but we count in dual custody. But we can't determine whether or not that control is operating without seeing both signatures there, so making sure that that's properly evidenced on the cash count forms. The timing of deposits, so making sure deposits are deposited in a timely manner, so we want to see at least weekly, if not possible, based on frequency, whatever makes sense. So we see a large volume of cash receipts. We want to make sure that's deposited in a timely manner. Cash held over summer, winter, and spring breaks. So making sure that you deposit those funds whenever there's a long break, right before the long break, and not holding on to that cash. Even if it's locked in a locked safe, there's still the opportunity for someone to steal some of the cash, so making sure that that gets into the bank deposit. And then for purchases, unsupported expenditures is another common area that we see for purchases. The lack of proper approval for expenditures, so if you have a purchase requisition form, making sure that goes through all the levels of approval and make sure that's properly signed and initialed. Bank reconciliations, making sure that there's a review that's occurring at least monthly of the bank reconciliation and the financial statements, and then initially you're signing that as well.
So before we get in the case study, I know Art and I both kind of covered all the different cycles that occur at ASB. We want to make sure if there are any questions about anything that we covered or just general questions you have that we could address those now. Or anything management wants to comment on? Yeah. Fortunately, you have to come up to the podium.
How are petty cash items handled? You mentioned things that are approved, you need a requisition, but for example, if the group agreed to have refreshments and you don't have a record to go down to pick up donuts or bagels, how is that handled?
So is this for the student club?
Yes.
I would say try to utilize, I mean, maybe there's not necessarily formalized forms for that, but try to utilize whatever forms you have to show maybe there's general approval over items like that there's agreement that these items, the student club wanted to buy these items if it's an organized ASB.
And I also work with the district office to understand what their policy is for petty cash, what dollar amounts are okay to go through petty cash versus going through the normal approval process. So talking with district management, understanding what their policies are. If there's
a threshold.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
There should be a threshold.
I've been a financial clerk for 18 years, and I was always told that we could not have a petty cash account. So I'd like to know when that was available. Is it really available? I don't want one.
There are no petty cash for ASBs. There may be a couple left that have a volume cash fund that might be in our special area, but none of our ASBs in secondary elementary school have petty cash.
Yeah, it's not common for us to see petty cash at ASB sites either, but yeah, so it sounds like there's only a few left.
Any other questions?
How do I handle cash donations, parents' donation to the class? It's not a club, but it's a class. Donations to the class teacher.
So the teacher, so they're, let's say they give $50 to the class, and the teacher should turn in those funds to the ASB clerk, and then it goes through the same process, making sure that the dual count is performed, and then.
Deposited to a, where,
Is it going to the general, so.
it's
I'm
not a
assuming,
club,
Is it elementary school?
high school.
High school, because I believe that they usually have a teacher's account as well, right? That goes through the ASB funds?
All the these will be also on our website for you on the, yeah, I have those donations for your class accounts.
So it does, it does not go to the ASB.
It does, yeah. These are donations for your classes. Actually, those are treated as clubs. Your class accounts are trust accounts. They're taking them in the after minutes. Students are putting on, but when they're accepting donations from parents, they'll be deposited into their trust account for that class account.
So here's the question. So typically, the art teacher, right, is needing donations for supplies to play or whatever for art. And so they make a request out to the parents, say, can you support, provide us some extra dollars to be able to buy supplies for ceramics or whatever. So the question is it treated like a typical kid club account, I call them kid accounts, where they've established a club and they've developed protocols that you've outlined? That is very different from the teacher saying, hey, in order to allow you to have access or greater experiences in you, we need to take in money. So then you're saying it's a teacher club account, and the confusion is then, where does all the minutes play in? Because it's not really a kid account, it's the teacher driving it on behalf of students.
Jeff, I thought you were referring to like the freshman, sophomore, senior classes. I'm sorry. So you're just referring to the curriculum, collecting monies for like an art project. And those are going to be cleared. Those will be sent up to the district, maybe to the district. And I don't, yeah, those are.
So those were 96,000 accounts.
Yeah, the finance would be best to answer that, but yes, those are going to be. Those are not clubs. They're donated for a particular project. It's not a forced purchase. They want to, whatever the situation is, but those will be paid to the district. And I believe they'll do on your 96,000, then you'll follow the regular district procedures. Okay, I was mixing up your class.
Yeah, I think those are good questions. I think it's always important to work with the district to see what the different policies are, because I know from school side to, or from district to district for us, the policies are a little bit different. But basically everything we covered today, those are the items that you're going to be responsible when we audit you. There's nothing, I don't think, that we didn't cover that when we do an ASB audit that we wouldn't look at or you wouldn't be responsible for. Any other questions?
All right. Yeah, for the high schools, it's much more complicated under this ASB umbrella, right? Where we're dealing with booster clubs and outside organizations that are continually fundraising, and the accounting of the money and the abating of the money based on the expenses of those. That wasn't covered at all up here, but all is under the ASB umbrella. I don't know, it's not a question or a comment.
No, it's definitely not as simple as straightforward sometimes as we said it to be. And that's where I think definitely the district and hopefully those in the finance department can help you understand the controls they want in place as far as for the ASB.
Jeffrey, we have a district procedure that does give you guidelines on that, and I will refer to that for our questions and answers. So for the art classes or any of the other classes, what do you do with those funds when they're donated?
Aren't they required this year to pass the
Are there any other questions for ASB?
Are you guys want to go over the case study now?
Oh, yeah, we have a case study. I wasn't sure if there's any more questions or if you were trying to cover something right now. But we do have a case study for you. If you flip to the next slide, there's a scenario. So let's take about 15 minutes, read through it, and then gather some of your thoughts, and we'll go over what your thoughts are on this case study. It's about another 5 minutes, and we'll go over some of the responses.
All right, we'll go ahead and go over the case study now, since everyone's had hopefully an opportunity to read through it and come up with some exceptions. I'll go ahead and read it again. It's Friday night at ABC High School, and they are playing against their biggest rival in the last basketball game of the season. The gymnasium is packed with spectators on both sides. Knowing this was going to be a big event, Andy, the athletic director, made sure to have extra ticket sellers and ticket takers. To ensure he had adequate coverage, he told teachers of the school what he would pay them each, $25 for their time. At the end of the night, Andy paid 10 teachers who helped out $25 in cash from the door fee collections. It was late when the game ended. ABC High School lost in the final seconds. Andy was tired and wanted to get on the road for his hour-long drive home. He decided to take the money collected from door fees home and would give it to the site controller first thing Monday morning. He counted the money at home and prepared the deposit form for the site controller. Andy put the deposit form in the school's drop safe before the site controller arrived on Monday. So what are the potential audit exceptions that you came up with based on this scenario?
I mean, think there are no issues.
Yeah, perfect. Sound good? Yeah. So if you have some odd exceptions, please come up to the mic and share those with us. Multiples is fine. However many you can come up with.
Well, the first thing is that the revenue receipts won't match the deposit. And you know that because he paid the teachers out of the proceeds. So that would be number one. Two, he didn't count it with anybody. He took it home. So it's at home for the weekend, which isn't good. Then I'm just kind of wondering who gave him the authorization to pay. I'm assuming employees.
Yeah, he took a lot of liberties saying he's going to just start paying them.
Yeah, so I think that's an issue. But those are the things that come right off the top of my head.
Yeah, good ones.
Okay.
Does anybody have something different? Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. I think this is going to be very common to all my financial peers in high school, homecoming night. So starting that we are supposed to get the approval first, as long as we receive it. Starting in the first paragraph, the payment for teachers is you have a union teacher, so that's completely against whatever is paying hourly, not only for the fixed time. Number two, taking the cash is completely inappropriate from the cash box. Number three, taking the money to the house. You are supposed to be calling security and be escorted to your office and put it on the safe overnight, even if you're really tired from the night. That's it.
Very good responses.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of risk involved as far as misappropriation of assets. So. All right.
Okay, the very first thing is knowing there was a big game, have extra ticket sellers and taker. We're only entitled to have 4, no matter the size of the game. So teachers cannot do the pay. She said that's based on supervisors. Then it's paid on and it's a set amount. This year they changed $29.80. And before it was 79 something, and then the non-classroom teachers of classroom, they have a determined amount. Okay. And then all the classified staff, they're paid hourly depending if they have gone over 8 hours, then it becomes time and a half. Obviously, you don't take any money home. And the cash money, first of all, should have been counted immediately by 2 other people and signed. And it should, if you leave early, I know that at my school, and I think that's a rule, only myself, financial clerk, and 2 vice principal are allowed to have the combination of the safe. The principal is never allowed to have the combination of the safe. And the deposit, I count all the tickets, the inventory of the tickets, then subtract my original cash fund. Then the remainder, I see if that cash matches. I count usually I count with the other ticket sellers. We sign both. Then I fill out, I have a duplicate sheet of all the numbers, what the event was, date, All the money is collected, coins, checks, whatsoever, total, I sign, they sign, I enter in front of them on Blue Bear. It's a duplicate. I keep the original, staple the receipt. That's going to be on the backup of my daily transactions. And the other one I put on my game folder. So when I do my month-end reconciliation, I have everything supporting. So I attach the actual original cash fund, and the AD signs and counts the cash that's in the box, leaves that with me. That's counted back. And then my deposit, I have 3 parts. I received, I count that cash box, I take out my fund, then I do the deposits, and I also take inventory, and that goes all supported in the back of the daily cash receipts.
All right.
Sounds like you have a very good understanding of your controls. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
So I think you mentioned some things that I want to point out that I saw when I put this scenario together. So one of the things is that pre-numbered tickets. I think you provided a good response to it. So we typically see for events pre-numbered tickets because you could reconcile back to what was actually received. You have inventory of the range of ticket numbers. So if you're missing 5 tickets for $5, you expect $25 in your deposit. So be able so support that through pre-numbered ticket sales. The other thing that we saw, or that we had in here, was the payment to the individuals that are helping out. You should not pay people through ASB funds. It should go through district payroll, because there's other things that aren't considered that you need to go through. That's why you need to go through district payroll. The other thing was taking the cash home. I heard that response from a few of you. That's a no-no. You shouldn't take cash home. The cash should be counted in dual custody right after the event, and then evidenced, and then deposited into a safe at the district office. Were there any other items that you? Okay.
Anything else? Yeah. Could you come up?
We're looking at the athletic director and his responsibility, but we're not really losing sight of the 10 employees who took cash that should be rectified for their own internal services, for their own taxes, because that's income.
Yep, that's why it's very important to go through district payroll for any payments to employees.
Yeah, definitely outside of the scope of ASB.
There's benefits to consider, there's wages to consider, there's a lot of things to consider that you can't just simply pay someone $25 for the night.
Some good responses. Anything else? All right, well, that basically concludes our presentation, our formal presentation. Certainly we'll open up to Q&A, and then I think the district has a few items they're going to cover.
Yeah, thank you, Art and Joel. I know a lot of you, this is to cover the controls for the disbursements and the receipts and the governing board to understand that area. I know a lot of you have questions regarding our internal procedures, which we will be working with you on that for further training. So what I wanted to share with you right now is just to make you all aware of our district's fraud hotline. That's been activated since 2006, and we are continuing on using that. It's a system where you could call in 7 days a week, 24 hours. It's handled by a third party. You could be anonymous when you call that in. There's also a website that you could report it through the web system. And we would prefer that you give as much detail that you can give. So as we're following through on this, it makes it easier for us. We prefer that you leave your name and number, because that allows us to then follow back up with you if we have any further questions. But I have a handout that I copied here this morning on the fraud hotline that gives you the instructions to call, the number to call in. I believe, and again, it is anonymous if you'd like. They don't have a caller ID on the system. They're not going to try to track you down or anything if you prefer not to leave your name and number. And I believe that's it.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Susan. That was Susan Gerald. She's with our Fiscal Control Internal Audit Department. And I want to thank Joe and Arthur for coming out today and talking us through some of these ASB points. Again, there were just a few key takeaways that I really hope that you take back to your buildings and take seriously. I work with the external auditors after they do their initial field work in the spring, when they look at your ASB accounts and they come back to my office and they present me with some of the things that they saw. Real important, the dual cash counts. Please take that information back to your school. I know it's difficult at some smaller buildings, but we really need to get that procedure nailed down. That's something that comes up every year in our audit, and it came up again this year. So I want to make sure that we talk to everybody about that. The other thing, too, I want to point out is the fraud hotline. The district is committed to this fraud hotline. It is continuing, even though our internal audit department, as we knew it, has been transformed a little bit. But the Quality Assurance Office has taken over the responsibilities of monitoring the fraud hotline. So it's an important tool here at San Diego Unified, and please don't hesitate to use that tool in that event. Because like the auditor said at the very beginning, and I've heard this time and time again at fraud seminars, the auditors aren't the people who catch the fraud. It's you. It's your tips. And I hope that after coming to this today, you have an opportunity to go back to your buildings and look at things with a fresh perspective. And I know that the folks here are the diligent folks who are careful and follow the internal controls and follow the district's procedures. But you may see other folks who aren't familiar with those procedures or may be intentionally not following those procedures. So take that perspective back to your building and be aware of that. If you see opportunities for internal control improvements, and I think the lady who stepped up here and shared her best practices, that was excellent, and that's what we expect. And you're a resource for our district, and my staff hopes to work with you on those best practices and be able to share them throughout the district. So thank you. Thank you for coming today. That's all we have. Thank you.